Do you see similarities in what happened when you were a child and what's happening now?
Many similarities. The total destruction. Why do I say that? Because in my experience in contact with Palestinians, they are not revengeful. They are remarkably tolerant people, contrary to what is said about them. And there they lined up people and shot them directly into the Danube. And this friend was holding his mother's hand as this happened. My name is Stephen Kapos, and I am a child survivor of the Holocaust.
What is your earliest childhood memory?
My father was a GP in two small villages not far from Budapest, and my first memory is the garden and the environment of that place when I was there from when I was born till about age 5 when we moved to Budapest. I have memories of this building that my father built as a GP, which was the only modern building in the village. Was referred to as the Mad Doctor's house because it had a flat roof and a projecting balcony and round windows, and the terrace of it, there was a roof terrace with shower at the top, and there was a special room set aside for doing quartz treatment. It was kind of it was fashionable at the time to consider that healthy, to kind of get yourself brown. And I then still had an older brother, Peter, who was about a year older than me, and we were both in this quartz room a lot. I particularly remember the smell. It had a particular smell, that treatment. But unfortunately, he died just before reaching school age in polio. I was born in 1937, so that makes me 88 years old now and a half. I was 7 years old during the Holocaust.
So when did you first realize that you were in danger as a child?
I have to explain that because of the early age, age 7, wasn't very directly aware of danger. I was only aware that something was not quite right by reflection of how the adults behaved. I realized that they were very anxious at times. But I myself have not yet understood the dangers and so wasn't afraid. Even in situation when, thinking back on it, I ought to have been afraid, hiding on false papers in homes. Our location, which was close to the royal castle, happened to be the area where the last stand fight was fought out between the German Wehrmacht and the invading Soviet army. And it was house-to-house fighting. And sometimes we had to move because we fell into the first line, front line was going through us. I remember on one such occasion when we had to relocate across snow-covered back gardens and were being shot at from the not very far Russian lines because all they saw was a line of people crossing. And I remember bullets whistling past and what sound they made. And I was thinking at the time, that must have been a bullet. And without thinking, I knew I was nearly killed now. I took it as a fact, that I didn't take the next step. Therefore, I am in mortal danger. I just didn't think of that. Kept on going. In the interwar years, that is between the First and Second World Wars, there has been a rule of autocratic powers. Hungary had a ruler called the Regent, a retired Admiral Horthy, and he had final say on political matters, but it wasn't a total dictatorship. Only the Communist Party was banned. There was latent anti-Semitism during this right-wing government, which was more a kind of social phenomenon rather than, it did not prevent professional careers of Jewish people. Like my father, who was a doctor, he started as a GP and was quite successful as a GP. And then during his later years as GP, retrained as a psychoanalyst. And by the time the Holocaust reached us, which was in March 44, he was a practicing psychoanalyst in Budapest. So it was possible to have a professional career. Socially, at various places, Jews were excluded, like certain clubs, certain organizations, and socially, maybe not accepted as friends or except exceptionally, or invited socially to their homes and that kind of thing. So there was a degree of separation in that sense. Hungary was allied to Germany formally, and took part in the invasion of the Soviet Union alongside the Germans. They were more or less bribed into it by the return of certain lost, inverted commas, territories that were detached from Hungary after the First World War as part of the peace treaty. Hitler returned some of those territories, about half of them, say, against the cooperation with the attack on the Soviet Union. So they were allied. However, by 1944, it was such a late stage of the war, it became very clear that the Germans lost the war. Some of the allied countries, one by one, tried to leave their alliance and declare independence. Romania did that before Hungary. And Hungary was negotiating in the background about terms of leaving the alliance and what terms they would get from the Allied powers. And the German intelligence became aware of those approaches and therefore invaded. Although allied country, they still invaded to secure the country to themselves. Partly because it was a route to Romania, and the Romanian oil fields were very important at that stage. They are now exhausted, but in those days there were the so-called Ploiești oil fields. They came in 1940, March 1944, and immediately position of Jews worsened, because along with the German army in came Adolf Eichmann. And Eichmann, with some Hungarian help, it had to be admitted, immediately set about deportation of Hungarian Jews from the countryside. So they came in March. By June, July, 400,000 Hungarians from the countryside were deported to Auschwitz. And we know what happened there. Very few of them survived. So that's basically the Holocaust. It was, by that time, a program of extermination of a people, a genocide. So we had to relocate on one occasion. These relocations were somewhat similar to what some of the Gazan people experienced, because you'd have to leave a place, but without a safe address to go to. On one occasion, we tried to be housed temporarily in a school, which was turned into a temporary military hospital, and we were given a room there. We became aware that the local nurses realized that we were a group of Jewish boys, although we had done sort of false pretenses that we weren't, and false papers. They suspected that this wasn't so. My aunt, who was in charge of our group, overheard people saying amongst themselves, "Oh, we don't believe these are refugees from the front. I think they're Jews." And that was dangerous. I mean, I realized this was happening, and we suddenly had to up and go again.
When were you separated from your parents?
It was in October 1944, on the day when the regent made the declaration of Hungary leaving the alliance. By that time, things were very dangerous, and my parents had access, through my uncle, one way or another, to a rescue group called the Good Shepherd Organization, which was an organization set up to to save Jewish children, and were set up jointly by the two Protestant churches, not the Catholics, but there were Calvinist and Lutheran churches in Hungary. And those two churches, and supported by the Swiss Red Cross. And in charge was a man, a great humanitarian pastor, uh, Gabor Stelo. He has been a hero, really, because he started with a small group. There's a Swiss connection because he's related to the so-called Hagemacher family, who were big brewers like the Guinness family in Hungary, and had partial Swiss relations. And this family was already in Switzerland from the beginning of the war, and they had a palatial villa in the Buddha Hills, a very posh location close to the royal castle, overlooking the town. Because they were already in Switzerland, through his cousin, Gabor Stelo was a cousin of the Hagamahas, given this villa to start rescue operation. So he started the first protected home. This was meant to be for children escaping as refugees from the advancing Russians from the Eastern Front. And they were supplied with false names and false papers under the protection of the Swiss Red Cross and the Protestant churches. And in the end, he saved 2,000 children and adults, risking his own life. I mean, he wasn't Jewish. That was an amazing hero. There is now a beautiful monument to him in central Budapest, right in front of his church, his main church, which is Lutheran church, which is called Evangelical Church, but it's not evangelical in the U.S. sense. The sculpture monument and sculpture was designed by one of the boys he saved, who became a noted sculptor. My mom and my aunts, they all became nurses with some kind of improvised Red Cross uniform of these homes. My mom was separated from me because she was in charge of a group of girls, whereas I was in charge, I was included in a group of boys. With my little subgroup, it was my aunt who was in charge. But we weren't allowed to recognize relationship.
How long did it last, and how were you feeling day to day?
The fighting, well, I was in these homes from October. And to begin with, it was fairly easy, reasonable food, and we could go into the garden. And I remember great big bangs while in the garden because the Germans were blowing up the bridges. It was from Christmas that the real fighting was starting, right after Christmas. My mother came to visit at Christmas. That was a tremendous heroic act on her part because by that time it was very dangerous to be walking in the streets. And her only protection was a photograph of her in Red Cross uniform, these kind of false improvised Red Cross uniform. And on the back of it, she managed to get a local police station to certify her name and date of birth, etc. And the fact that she was of the Reformed Church Protestant religion, falsely. And that's all the protection she had for ID. And I do have that photograph, and in 2 copies, actually. As I say, it started in Christmas time and ended by February, because by that time we were at a different place in a basement cellar with lots of others hiding out. And I realized what mortal danger we were in many times, although not at the time, I didn't realize it. But and other things that I took for granted, like having to wear a yellow star before we went into hiding. I just did it as a matter of course. You had to wear this thing. All right. So we have wear this thing. Jews of Budapest were spared for a while, with an intention to deal with them later, but they ran out of time, in fact. And altogether, we lost 15 members of my family to the Holocaust. So it was a vicious extermination. Let me explain the story of one of my school friends. He became a school friend immediately after the war. In elementary school, his name was Yuri Ligeti. His story was he was my desk mate. The classroom was arranged in a series of fixed um, benches of double seats. So everybody had one kind of desk mate, very old fashioned desk with flap up tops and things like that, inkwells. His story was, this friend, that he was walking somewhere in Budapest in a dangerous period after the fascists took power directly from the regent I mentioned earlier. He made a declaration of leaving the alliance without any backup. And of course, he was immediately arrested by the Germans and deported himself. And the alternate fascists, who were called the Arrow Cross Party, and their bands, Arrow Cross bands, came to power. And these marauding Arrow Cross bands were armed and very dangerous and almost sadistic, and they were hunting Jews. This friend with his mother was caught in a street and arrested by these bands, and along with others taken to the side of the Danube when there was a higher shore, because at other places there were steps right down to the river, and there they lined up people and shot them directly into the Danube. And this friend was holding his mother's hand as this happened and was shot in, and his mother sank right beside him. He was only shot through the arm, and the fast flowing river Danube took him down very quickly, several hundred meters, and where he sort of scrambled out. And he was overlooked by a block of flats, and somebody noticed that this poor boy was coming and went down and rescued him, took him to his flat, and he survived and appeared in my class. He was probably the brightest guy in the class, but very nervous, obviously traumatized. Later, some distant relatives took him to a US, I think. Anyway, I haven't had further contact after a couple of years at the primary school.
What was his name?
George Ligeti, by coincidence, the same name as the famous composer you might have heard of. But that's not a too uncommon name in Hungary. After primary school, and I ought to mention that the first 2 or 3 years after liberation were relative democracy. But by 1948, by various means, the Communist Party gained power by fusion with the Social Democrats and then various tricks. Eventually, they were on their own till 1956, when was the uprising against this regime. I went to a secondary school, which was architectural secondary school. We had after 4 years of the secondary school, you were given a intermediate sort of higher technician's qualifications, and then you could either take a job directly or with that, or go to university. And when I was at second year at university, there was ferment politically for a year. It climaxed at a meeting of my university. And when I went in the following day to thinking that would be a normal, straightforward university day, there wasn't. People were milling around, getting ready for a big demonstration, which was banned. Delegation kept going to the Minister of Interior until he relented and allowed a demonstration to start on certain conditions, of closed orders, and because of certain provocative responses from the ruling government, it exploded by the evening with a battle in front of the radio building, and they invaded the radio building, and then the official government called in the Soviets. So the demonstration started early afternoon, and by the evening there were tanks, Soviet tanks on the streets. And when that was put down, there was a great disappointment. People generally didn't want to go back to the suppression of the Stalinist regime, which it was afraid that it would restart again under the Soviet. And a lot of people were leaving illegally because the borders were quite open at that time. A year before, they still had barbed wire borders and towers, watchtowers, and it was impossible, and minefields to cross. It was impossible to leave. There was a period of thaw politically, and all these things were taken up towards Austria. So the borders were wide open, and with guides, you could walk across from Hungary to Austria, and this is what we did. We arrived into collecting camps, sorting camps in Eisenstadt. On the day of arrival, you could join a train load going to the UK. You could have gone in any direction except the US. Me and my cousin, who I was with, were determined to go to the UK. We had certain connections. We saw the advantages of the English language, and there were promises by the World Service, BBC World Service, to provide grants to students to continue their studies or whatever they were studying. So I thought I would continue my studies in architecture, which is what happened. So I arrived with a refugee status. I became a British citizen only 10 years later. I continued my architectural studies in the Regent Street Polytechnic, which was the second best architecture school at that time, now absorbed into Westminster Uni. I obtained a grant as was promised. And as a year-out student, after my fourth year of studies, I went into an office of Frederick Gibbard, a big office. He was the architect for at that time for the Heathrow Airport, Harlow New Town, various power stations. After a while, I left that office because I was too strictly regarded as a designer, art-com designer type, and I wanted to learn the detailed technical aspects of architecture as well, which I couldn't in that office until we reached about the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. I got married. My wife was an American citizen, and then quickly we had children, a boy and a girl. And then the office continued, really carried on. About 85, when during the Thatcher period, there was a downturn of our kind of workload. Then I left and retired soon after. I was an activist. I became an officer even of the Labour Party, vice chair brackets campaigns, co-vice chair brackets campaign for a couple of years, and also secretary sometimes of the local branch. And that was fine until came the period when Frank Dobson resigned, and the replacement MP was Keir Starmer. I got to know him locally. I was member of the Labour Party when I was invited by a small socialist group to address them on Holocaust Memorial Day as a Holocaust survivor with direct experience. This group warned me that they are they were at that time already proscribed by the Labour Party, so that they were on a bad organizations list. But I said, well, I don't mind. I would give a talk to anybody who asked me. So immediately I got a letter from the regional office of the Labour Party to warn me that if I go ahead speaking to this group on Holocaust Memorial Day, there will be a disciplinary investigation against me, which I thought was pretty bad, because I don't see why I couldn't speak about the Holocaust.
Tell me about your thoughts of what is going on.
Of course, I was horrified and provoked by attack on Gaza after October the 7th. Obviously had aspects that I disapprove of. Anything Hamas did against civilians was not acceptable. But the response was out of all proportion, and I was horrified at the cruelty of it. And so I joined marches straight away. When I got involved with this group, which I joined, the Holocaust survivors, we had a particular function to prove that Jews don't necessarily support Israel and the Zionists and their policies. Marches themselves were smeared by the government and the opposition, the Zionists, as no-go areas for Jews, which is absolute untruth, really, because we are declaring who we are, and we are always very warmly welcomed, and there are Jewish contingents marching alongside the others, the Jewish bloc, so-called. So that's our function, is to counteract the lies about the Jewish attitudes in relation to the genocide. For a start, the right-wing Zionist groups claim to speak for the entire Jewish community. They call it the Jewish community. They speak in the name of. Well, there isn't a solid Jewish community. There are various aspects of the community. There are supporters and those many left-wing Jews who oppose all this, and trying to pretend as they do that Jews automatically identify with Israel and what Israel is doing at any time. There are such people, but not the majority, claiming that what we call the conflation of Jewishness with the genocide and Zionism is counterproductive. From a Jewish point of view, it actually creates anti-Semitism, grows it, rather than counteracts it, as they claim. Also, on one of the demonstrations that I attended, I noticed 2 or 3 people standing there with placards hanging from their neck saying, "We are descendants of Holocaust survivors against the genocide in Gaza." And I thought that was such a good idea. I joined them, but I was their first survivor. They were descendants of survivors. I sort of raised the profile a little bit by being a direct survivor. So now we have actually two child survivors, but I am the only one with actual memory of the Holocaust who can still give an account. The other one, and same as my sister, they are all babies, were babies at the time. And I discovered now that pretty much I am the only Holocaust survivor on the left, not a Zionist, who is available and can still speak up with direct memories.
Do you see similarities in what happened when you were a child and what's happening now?
Many similarities. The total destruction. As I said, we were in World War II in 1944 at the epicenter of the last fighting. And there was total destruction all around us. And I see that in Gaza. It looked similar. Mind you, not all of Budapest by any means, but just in that concentrated area around us where the last fighting was. The royal castle was burnt out. I remember escaping on top of mounds of glass and rubble, and in the background the huge castle building burning, and further in the background, the Russian rocketry, the Katyushas were shooting off into the sky. And then when it was over and you looked round, the destruction all round, the rubble, the burnt out tanks, the discarded ammunition, bodies here and there, helmets, everything, dead horses. I mean, it was a horrible sight. It was not dissimilar to what you see on the screens about Gaza. But I keep pointing out that the difference is that in the World War II experience, that was the byproduct of two large armies fighting it out. Whereas in Gaza, it's deliberate destruction to obliterate a people, including their culture and their livelihood and their homes, so that it should not be possible to stay. So that's just one aspect of the similarities. But there sometimes talk about what I term as the invisible pain. This is the difficulties of coping under Holocaust or genocide conditions with various aspects of life that is not very obvious. For example, when you are told to move on, either by necessity like we had to, because we were the building was shot to pieces above us, or because some flyers tells you to move on within 24 hours or 48 hours, stated so-called safe areas, which actually turn out not to be safe. But anyway, so you have to get up and go. There's no transport. You have to walk. You can only take a little bits of your possessions with you. But what do you do with disabled members of the family? And this is something that my family had faced in Transylvania. They were offered at one point safe passage to Romania, which was a much safer place at that time. And they had to turn it down because there was a disabled member of the family who could not take the kind of bumpy horse carriage ride that was involved. And they all got transported to Auschwitz, and only one of them came back. There must be similar situations in Gaza. In fact, I know so because I went to an organization, a Palestinian organization called P21 Gallery. At one point, they ran a program of letters from Gaza where people were describing their experience of living under those conditions. These dilemmas came to the fore. You know, there's a disabled member of family, and we're told to move on. What do we do? Do we leave him behind? Do we all stay to keep company and be exposed to bombing? Those kind of agonizing decisions. Well, my family had to face these in different ways. And also the instantaneous loss of your family home by destruction. Suddenly have to, at a glance, take in the fact that you are made homeless. Well, we had that as well. When we returned to our old flat from Buda to Pest with my mom, my father was still in Belgium. And at a glance, we realized that we were homeless because the external walls were all down, and we were looking into what appeared like a doll's house situation. At every level, you could just had open flats, so we couldn't stay there.
Looking at the world today, are you hopeful?
I think in the long term, yes. Personally, I think that there is no recovery from a genocide. And I think that the Israeli and Zionist project have made themselves morally destroyed. And it's only a matter of time when they will be actually destroyed. By that I mean that particular form of racist state and apartheid system will be gone, and the only thing possible as continuation is as a one-state solution, which is democratic and equally just to each ethnic group. And that might mean that a number of late arrival Israelis who had joined illegal settlements in the last few years will have to return. They probably won't accept majority Palestinian rule and will leave. Those who are genuinely democratic in their attitude, I'm sure could stay without any problems. Why do I say that? Because in my experience in contact with Palestinians, they are not revengeful. They are remarkably tolerant people, contrary to what is said about them. In fact, I find it difficult to understand it. Why is that so? It's maybe a function of the religion, I don't know, or long-term community tradition. I sometimes say that their very delicate embroidery expresses the spirit of the people. They are exceptional people. The message I would give to people is that when there are great injustices in the world being perpetrated, you should not turn the other way. That whatever you are capable of, you can't demand of people to be heroes. Some are natural heroes and act it out and don't mind even going to prison for their views of justice. But in some way that you are capable of, you've got to make a stand, like at least joining the demonstrations, which is what I'm doing.